So put your hands up, please, if you have taught any compulsory film modules or done any compulsory film studies type teaching this past academic year. Okay. And keep your hand up if there has been any, if you've taught Hollywood on any of those courses. Okay, so come a few people, okay, so further this down. And now put your hands up if you have taught any optional modules or kind of like teaching classes over this last year. So if you taught anything that's kind of like an optional one where the students had a choice, okay. And again, leave your hands up if you taught Hollywood on those courses. Okay.
In part or in whole?
Well, if there was some Hollywood, a significant bit of Hollywood. So I think that is also already kind of like quite sort of like interesting. And I guess I'm kind of asking that kind of question first, partly to think about, as I said, you know, where does kind of Hollywood sit in these kind of like discussions that we're kind of like having? And I guess the point I want to come into this is that whilst I'm not denying that there isn't decades of really important and brilliant critical scholarship on Hollywood, specifically, you know, kind of like film studios, etc., but I do think its ubiquity and overrepresentation in UK film studies classrooms and related spaces is often unquestioned and taken for granted. And from that perspective, I think that UK film studies has played quite a significant part in, I guess, kind of like in creating Hollywood's dominant kind of like discursive kind of like position as well. And it's a dominance that we can think of in terms of actual numbers and material kind of like presence, in terms of how many classes on modules are Hollywood classes, how many courses are just Hollywood kind of like modules, but also in terms of the kind of like resources as well. Thinking about, think about, you know, kind of like those big film studies conferences like BAFTA and Screen. You know, how many of those papers are Hollywood papers as well? So there's a kind of material kind of presence of kind of like Hollywood, an over-representation, I would argue. And I think it matters, it's important for us, partly because even if we are not doing Hollywood ourselves, every other type of cinema has always been defined in relation to Hollywood. So even if you're doing those world cinema courses, you're probably, in some way, there is going to be some comparison. There's going to be some, this is not Hollywood kind of like conversation in those kind of classes. So whether we're talking about independent cinema, art house cinema, avant-garde cinema, documentary, those are always classified in relation to mainstream Hollywood popular cinema conventions, but also those kind of other national cinemas as well. I think there's a sense that Hollywood has been extremely successful for film studies in the UK, including for white women and feminists and white gay men as well. But arguably, I would say it's been far more problematic for British people of colour. Not least given the very kind of complicated and even antagonistic ways in which Hollywood-centric film studies in the UK emerges alongside post-colonial British diasporic and multicultural histories as well. So, you know, what are the political, critical, racial implications of US and Hollywood cinema for UK film studies and film studies classrooms in a post-colonial and multicultural Britain? I think that it's important. I think that it's another way that maybe we don't think enough about kind of like Hollywood. As I said, also that, you know, Hollywood, I think, matters to this workshop and the conversations we've been having, because the curriculum is not a sort of an infinite space. Yeah, and you know, we can add Hollywood films by and about white women and by and about African Americans, which will diversify the kind of curriculum in important ways. But again, still that question about what about those other cinemas, right? Especially those outside of kind of like Western Europe. Yeah, where is that class going to go? And you know, whilst I don't want to fuel these kind of like feverish kind of like right-wing headlines about replacing white men, I do think that something has got to go if you want to bring something in, because we are not working with infinite spaces and resources. So I think there is a bit of truth to that too. Um, Before I kind of go into the idea of what we could, how and what we could possibly replace Hollywood with in the classroom, this is where the Bollywood will come in, I think also that there are ways that we can question and flag up how and why we study Hollywood in the kind of classroom it's sort of like self, you know, defamiliarizing it, challenging its universality, that universality which has always othered every other cinema, yeah, that there is something that is also, I think, part of our kind of like job, whether we are kind of like teaching it or not. One of the things that I sort of started introducing, I'm quite lucky here that I've taught lots and lots of times with kind of like Stephen, I've worked also with quite recently with kind of Leader as well, so people kind of know I guess how I kind of like work, the slightly chaotic way that I work sometimes. But you know, one of the things that I've done in the last few years when teaching Hollywood courses at King's is that, you know, one of my first questions I ask the students is, oh well, okay, if there are no kind of like students from the US here, do you think of Hollywood as a foreign cinema? You know, and actually just seeing the kinds of responses. The first time I ever did it, there was a bit of a, like, what is he sort of saying, kind of like look on people's faces. But it just brings, I think there's that thing of foregrounding and getting them to think critically about why we are doing this sort of cinema here. And just like I said, just slightly defamiliarizing it and reminding them that Hollywood on the syllabus is often still a choice as well. Yeah, somebody has kind of chosen, you know, to kind of like teach that particular kind of like film. The other way I think that's kind of important, I think, is in terms of contextualizing and interrogating the critical discourses on Hollywood, particularly in relation to the work of scholars based in the UK. And, you know, as we kind of said sort of a little bit kind of earlier, in one of the earlier kind of discussions, you know, one of the things I think that's really, that I think some people find a bit excessive, but I think one of the, I think the most important critical skills that I learned from doing my BA and MA at King's was the way that we analyze the readings as kind of like text, the way that we contextualize the kind of readings. We didn't take them for kind of like granted. We weren't always able to do it very well, but we kind of like tried. I feel like it's a kind of a good habit that I've picked up, and I try and kind of like do that in my kind of classrooms as well. The 70s and 80s era, when film studies emerges as the academic discipline we know today, is also the same period when there was quite a lot of other stuff going on politically as well. And yet so much of that canonical scholarship only cares about classic Hollywood cinema. And I think certainly in terms of my own practice, becoming more aware, having done this kind of like film noir PhD, looking at all this kind of classic Hollywood stuff, and then becoming more aware of British diasporic histories, because like so many British people of colour, we were not taught these histories, and we've had to find them out and learn them ourselves later on. And you suddenly kind of like realise, oh, you know, at the same time that all these people are white UK film studies scholars are writing about classic Hollywood, oh, there are like racial uprisings going on. You know, this is the National Front is around. Enoch Powell is saying all sorts of kind of things. So there's quite a lot going on at that same time. And I find that one of the, and I think this is both, I think one of the qualities of, I think, some of that canonical scholarship, that there's a sort of weird timelessness about it that kind of like holds up. But that timelessness, I think, also comes from the fact that they're not really talking about what's going on around them. And in some cases, on the doorsteps of the institutions where they're literally kind of like working. And so this is one of the kind of like ways in which I guess I have been kind of thinking a bit more kind of critically about that kind of like scholarship. I mean, even with, you know, the really influential white feminist scholarship, white British feminist scholarship from that time, there are very few references to Thatcher. You know, it's really, it's a bit weird, I think. Yeah, and I guess the bigger issue related to that is that there's that absence and kind of erasure of kind of positionality in that kind of like work. That are we supposed to believe that there is no difference between a white British perspective and a white US perspective on this kind of like work, that there is a kind of a term that I'm kind of playing around with, slightly influenced by Gilroy. I haven't thought it out yet, but there's a kind of white Atlantic thing going on between scholars based in the UK and Hollywood cinema in this kind of particular era of incredible, you know, diasporic post-colonial kind of like turmoil. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done on this kind of like issue. I don't think that we can have an anti-racist film studies or a decolonized, decolonial film studies without first identifying the specificities of racism and coloniality in UK film studies. We need to know where the problem comes from before I think we can actually talk about how we're going to dismantle it, right? And I think going back and thinking about that work in these kind of more contextual ways, even if it upsets people, I think is kind of really, really important. Within this kind of like paper, again, I'm kind of like conscious of like centering kind of like Hollywood. So now I want to move on to thinking about kind of like popular Hindi cinema and Bollywood. So I guess what I'm doing here is, I guess I'm making kind of like more like kind of proposals and kind of like ideas rather than, like I said, going into kind of like detail in terms of kind of like research and stuff. But hopefully you're kind of like, hopefully you're with me on this. So popular Hindi cinema and kind of like Bollywood. So I want to re-ask this kind of like teaching question that I asked before. How many of you who taught on compulsory modules or classes in this last year had a popular Hindi film on those courses? Okay, and how many of you who did optional kind of like modules or classes had a popular Hindi film on any of those classes? Okay. Which ones did you have?
I had an art house Hindi film.
Oh, well, which one?
Satyajit Ray's Home in the World.
We're not talking about Satyajit Ray in this conversation. No. What did you?
It's not exactly Hindi, but it was triple R.
Okay, I was going to say RRR doesn't kind of like count either, but I mean, I think it's, again, but it's important, but again, asking that kind of question, and part of the reason why I'm asking that kind of question is because, you know, it's this thing where, you know, there are two global popular cinemas, right? There are two global popular cinemas, but there's this weird thing where we only like teach one of them, you know? I mean, I feel on some level, it has to be one of the greatest academic scams of all time. How could a discipline get away with ignoring the most popular, biggest thing in its field? I mean, you know, it's kind of like, you know, it's wild. I think it's wild. I'm going to skip through some of these quotations just a little bit. I'm going to say a couple of bits. Also, a lot of the slides I'm going to be sort of showing are ones that I use in classes as well. So I just kind of like will possibly pick a few kind of like bits out from them. So the other thing then that is kind of often challenging when we're kind of like talking about, when we're dealing with popular Hindi cinema in the kind of classroom, is that, you know, often we don't have the luxury of a whole course on popular Hindi cinema or even on Indian cinema. And more likely we get like a class, like one class to kind of like do the whole of the biggest cinema in the world, right? And, you know, whenever I'm kind of faced with that situation, which does kind of like happen, you know, I kind of always kind of like foreground that to the kind of like students. I say, you know, like, how, you know, do you expect me, how do I expect myself to be able to summarize the biggest cinema in the world into like kind of like 45 minutes? You know, we have to kind of like start from scratch in a way that we wouldn't have to do for Hollywood. But at the same time, you know, could you imagine having a film course where you only had a film program, where you had just one class to do Hollywood cinema? I don't know, maybe at SOAS perhaps, but imagine you had just like one class to do Hollywood cinema, and like what film would you kind of like choose? We would never, it's hard to even think about it because we couldn't, I think it's hard to even imagine that kind of film studies in the kind of like UK. Part of the reason then why some of the reasons why popular Hindi cinema I think is so important. Nipa Majumdar, in this quite useful book about kind of like teaching film, has this kind of quite useful chapter on teaching kind of Indian cinema. And here again she talks about again this idea of like popular Hindi cinemas, popularity in the kind of like the world, you know, the cinema that arguably has a larger international presence than Hollywood, at least in terms of audience numbers. Indian cinema has been the other dominant mainstream cinema against which various counter cinemas have struggled, including India's own regional cinemas and its art cinema. Because Indian cinema exemplifies an alternative type of hegemonic cinematic form, it presents an opportunity to defamiliarize the idea of Hollywood as the worldwide norm for mainstream cinema. And whilst I think it's really important that popular Hindi cinema and Bollywood should be studied for itself, I guess the direction that I want to kind of go in now is also thinking about what popular Hindi cinema and its absences and marginalizations also can tell us about kind of like how Hollywood works, that Hollywood's role in the coloniality of kind of like film studies in the UK. Okay. So there's a really long history of Indian cinema in the UK, as well as kind of like globally as well. So that huge kind of like global kind of like popularity covering kind of like places, including the Middle East, Africa, various kind of African countries, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Russia and the Soviet Union, Turkey, the Caribbean, and also those Western nations where significant South Asian diasporic communities have settled. So Canada, the US, Australia, and especially the UK. That long history of Indian cinema in the UK is closely intertwined with British Asian diasporic histories themselves. So, that certainly in the kind of like in the 1970s, I think I've got a bit of a missed a bit possibly. Okay. Okay, I'll come to that bit in just a minute. And it continues to be, and popular Hindi cinema continues to kind of like dominate, both in terms of outnumbering and outperforming other non-English language cinemas at the kind of like UK box office. So if you've ever had a look at the BFI, they have their kind of annual kind of like yearbooks where they have all the kind of like stats for the year. They have a separate kind of bit where they have all the stats for the kind of foreign language films. I use this one here for 2007, partly because one of the films I usually teach when I'm doing Bollywood is Om Shanti Om, so I use this one for that purpose. But you know, out on that table, 13 out of those 20 films are Bollywood films. And 3 of them are also set in the UK as well. So this is another kind of quite important kind of like aspect of this. By about 2012, popular Hindi films are so outnumbering all the other kind of foreign language films. The BFI stats tables, they give popular Hindi cinema its own table. Oh my God, already? Oh, okay, right. So again, that incredible importance about how kind of like big and how kind of like popular it is. So one of the ways then I think that popular Hindi cinema is so important is in the way that it plays this really vital role in diasporic, British kind of like diasporic life. I don't think you can talk about British South Asian history or British diasporic history, or I would argue British cinema culture itself, without talking about kind of like the role of kind of like Bollywood as well. It's also referenced in lots of films. I'm going to just really skip through these. East is East, Nina's Heavenly Delights for like video, Bollywood appearing also then by the, especially by the kind of like 2000s in lots of kind of like, actually the UK appearing as a location in these films as well. So I might kind of make this the, like the, maybe do this as sort of the maybe the last little bit. I thought I'd planned my timing a little bit better. So the other thing that we kind of like have here is that we also have a post-colonial perspective on Britain and post-colonial Britain as well. These kind of like films emerge in the 1970s, interestingly, at the same time as British diasporic cinema is emerging as well. Films like Pressure, A Private Enterprise, Black Joy, in that same period is also when you first start seeing all these really big, not these ones on the slide, but you start seeing these really big Hindi films showing diasporic life in the UK. It's interesting, I think, also that that is the decade when you start seeing also Francophone African films about kind of like either going to Paris or wanting to go to Paris. So Tuki Buki, Soleo, etc. So again, there's something about that 70s era, again, thinking about kind of connections that's kind of like important. So I'm going to kind of whiz all the way sort of like through this. So Bollywood London, just mostly have all these images. So I'll just say a couple of ways in that I think you can kind of use popular Hindi cinema in the kind of classroom, because if we don't have the luxury of a whole module, then it's also that thing of where and how can we use it in the classroom, but also maybe in ways that kind of move away from that area studies kind of like approach as well. Because I think that all cinema directed by women, by people of colour, from the global south, or global majority even, always carries a certain kind of burden of representation. It can never just be cinema, yeah? It never gets treated just as cinema. So we will have lots of books talking about film style in Hollywood films and European kind of like films, but why does anyone analyse, Govinda Chadha's films for those kinds of things, or Ava DuVernay's films for those kind of issues? That the context sort of like overwhelm the kind of like the filmicness, the status as kind of like cinema itself. So again, thinking about ways of using it in classrooms for textual analysis, musical numbers work really, really well. I also kind of like use popular Hindi films in things where I'm doing like cinema in the city type kind of like stuff, talking about kind of like London. Again, I think it's that thing where you can use popular Hindi cinema. I wouldn't say in exactly the same ways as kind of like Hollywood, and this comes back to the question that I think Chris asked earlier about, do you just kind of like abandon the kind of like house? I think one of the things that for me that has been so useful about engaging with popular Hindi cinema is that I think you have like a moment of like revelation where you know that this is the biggest cinema in the kind of like world, you know how popular it is, and suddenly you'll have this kind of moment and you'll be like, oh, I suddenly see the kind of structures, the power dynamics that hold up film studies in the UK, and the role that invisibilized, that universalized role of Hollywood in this. And so I'm not going to come up here and say, well, popular Hindi cinema is more progressive than Hollywood cinema. Like, no way, right? But one, I think it reveals some of the discursive structures that keep Hollywood in that dominant position. But also, I think when it comes to things like misogyny, homophobia, anti-blackness, economic privilege, Islamophobia, I think it also allows us to maybe think about some of those issues in a far more kind of like global way as well. If I can be really quick, I did want to say something about the kind of precarity as well, just because I feel like I'm allowed to say something about precarity. Thank you. So I think the thing that, which I think is kind of like really important, is also thinking about how do we work in the kind of classrooms. And I think the conversation about, which I think Sarah was saying, well, if I'm on leave, who's going to do the kind of module? It will be someone like us. It will be one of us. And are we going to be paid enough to be able to do your classes? Are we paid enough to be able to use Lindiwe's, teaching toolkits, right? If we're in those kind of like precarious kind of like positions. So I think I think it's really important to also think about those kind of like those issues of kind of like precarity, the actual idea of labour, that it takes a lot of work, I think, to do this and to try and do this kind of like well. And it is a lot harder for some of us than others. I guess two things that just in terms of just like improving that sort of situation, I think it's really important when you are supporting PhD students and early career researchers. Nobody kind of like tells you that when you enter the classroom, it's this incredibly gendered and racialized space. I remember at King's teaching second week of a course on representation of African-American cinema, and it's week 2, we're doing birth relation, and I'm there in a seminar room with 17 white students. Nothing in my training has prepared me for that. They turned out to be a lovely group, and I was fine, but it's like, how do you prepare for things like that other than just trying to like just get through it, right? So thinking about that kind of like sort of like support, I think, is really kind of important. And the other thing which I think really important to think about this is also about feedback as well, especially negative feedback. And Lindiwe, in the kind of article that you wrote for the pass, or however you can like say it, talk about the impact of like having negative feedback on one of the iterations of your course. I think it's worth saying that not all of our students want diversified, decolonized kind of like curriculum, and unfortunately, sometimes straight white male students will write negative things in the feedback. So the other thing I think is important for those of you supervising and supporting emerging kind of like colleagues, I think you've got to also be like, you know, weigh the diversity versus the kind of like feedback, and also just to offer some kind of protection in those spaces, particularly for the early career researchers and PhD students of kind of like colour, because if we are in those classrooms, again, we talked about the positionality, I don't need to declare my positionalities when I enter a classroom. It's quite obvious to everyone, and those dynamics are kind of like there. We don't all have the luxury of being able to declare those kind of like positionalities. Sometimes they enter a room kind of like with us, and there's an emotional labor, I think, that also goes with teaching, that I think when we're talking about collaboration and all these other things, also that collaboration, it's not just let's get together and work on a project, but also in those very real ways, in those very material kind of like circumstances within the kind of classroom. I've totally gone over, I've missed a load of stuff, but hopefully I can talk about it later. Thank you.